Good evening, and thanks for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event. Welcome to any new people joining us this week, and to any people watching on Facebook, as well as people listening to the audio replay, which is being broadcast every Thursday at midday, Sundays at 4 p.m. on JA Community Radio at FM 88 in Melbourne or j-air.com.au. My name is Robert Gregory, and also on the screen is Dr. David Adler, President of the AJA, and our guest tonight, Maurice Newman, AC. The format will be a short interview followed by the chance to ask questions. If you'd like to ask a question, the best way is to raise your hand with the reaction button, and written questions can also be placed on the chat function. And if we have a chance, we may get to some, although we often have more questions than there is time. So our guest tonight, Maurice Newman, his career spans 40 years, stockbroking and investment banking, including as managing director in 1984 and executive chairman from 85 until 1999 of what is now the Deutsche Bank Group in Australia. While his experience as a senior businessman is too extensive to detail, notable highlights include chairmanship of the ASX as well as the ABC, which is going to be the topic for tonight. Mr. Newman is known to hold pragmatic, politically conservative views, which he is not reticent to express on a range of issues. He recently published an article titled The ABC of Delusion, which, as the name suggests, is a cutting critique of the ABC as it is currently. For tonight's event, AJA President Dr. David Adler will be conducting the interview. So thank you for joining us, Maurice, and over to you, David.
Okay. Maurice, thank you so much for agreeing to be our guest this evening. And before we began, you declared one interest. In fact, we've got two joint interests to declare. One is that we're both writers for the Spectator magazine. And the other is Advance Australia. Can you just say something about Advance Australia, just so people know?
Well, Advance Australia is an organisation which was established really to present a liberal view, liberal with a capital L, view of and channel of comment for Australians to subscribe to. I think we've been going about 5 years all up, and we've gone from zero in terms of subscribers and people who participate to over 250,000. And it's growing very rapidly, which suggests to me there is an appetite for this sort of commentary, which is not available elsewhere, or alternatively is diminishing elsewhere.
Okay. And you're the chairman of the advisory board. And I'm on the advisory board, and recently former Prime Minister Tony Abbott also joined. So I'm privileged to occasionally rub shoulders with esteemed people. So before we drill down on the subject, I wanted to ask you, because we've had conflicting information, do you have any Jewish heritage?
Yes, I have had a Jewish father.
Okay.
And his father came from Austro-Hungary. And also he had a Jewish mother.
So although you're not halakhically Jewish, there is some Jewish heritage there.
Yeah.
So how did someone with your values actually become chairman of the ABC? And how did you function in such an environment?
Well, of course, the ABC didn't select me. I was selected by John Howard, and I guess on that basis, the ABC had no say in my appointment. I have to tell you honestly that I initially declined the invitation because I didn't think that given I wasn't, for example, as artistically inclined as my predecessor, Donald MacDonald, and I wondered whether or not I would fit. In fact, it wasn't on the artistic side that I didn't fit, not that I was called upon to do very much in that regard, but certainly when it came to philosophy, I did not fit. And it was clear from the beginning. In fact, I had 2 stints on the ABC. Initially, I was there as director for 3 years and resigned on a matter of principle, because in my attempts to get some accountability into the place, what I had said to the board and what I had written to the chair was then leaked to other parts of the ABC and became a story in the press.
Wow.
And I thought that if I can't rely on the confidentiality of my fellow directors, I didn't want to be there. Now, I can't prove this to be the case. It certainly was a suggestion that the staff elected director was the person who leaked the information, but who knows whether that was true.
Yeah. I mean, as we see it from an outsider, it's a fairly toxic left-wing environment. Is it actually manageable in its current form?
I doubt that it is. I think that the culture is so inbred. I call it a self-serving collective, where the objective is other than what is laid down by the Charter, the Act and the editorial policies. And they're constantly in conflict with their obligations, but there are no consequences for that.
Well, I know that whenever there's a Conservative government, there's always a call to try to reform the ABC. And again, as an outsider, it seems that the government is very reluctant to tackle it. Is the ABC actually more powerful than government in some way? Is the government scared of the ABC?
I think it is, David. I think that it's a juxtaposition. There's no reason why any politician should be scared of the ABC, but by giving them that authority, then of course it elevates their position, and it means that no one in government, whether Labor or Liberal or coalition, has been prepared to tackle it. There've been, I think, if we go back, the only government that was prepared to actually take action was the Hawke government. But what I found in public service is that they tend to wait you out. And so once you've gone, they go back to their old ways.
Okay. I'm going to try to show a little bit of material through screen share. And let me see if I can get the slideshow going. Hopefully from the beginning. Okay, I'm just going to flip through a few things. This is actually a screenshot of your article that you wrote recently. It was published on the 24th of June, called The ABC of Delusion. Sackings as journalists stand hit rock bottom. We'll ask you about that a little bit more in a moment. But I've just pulled together a few things from our file. There seems to be an issue of morality. Here is an ABC item promoting the youngest drag queen in Australia, someone given the performance name of Candy Featherbottom. This is from a kids program called Home Alone, which would seem to be showing that if you're home alone with an animal, this is the sort of thing that you might do. Laura Tingle is one of the most prominent journalists in the ABC. Someone took issue with impartiality, so her retort was to go F yourself. This is some of our recent action. The only thing that's you can read there is probably the little headline, ABC hit with bias claim over Israel, where we had a couple of complaints which were upheld on the theme of the ABC not calling terrorists terrorists. This is an article that I wrote some time ago about how the ABC, in effect, although I'm not saying intentionally, but in effect, is providing exactly the sort of propaganda that organisations like Hamas would want. And here's something that's not as widely known as it should be. It's a transcript, a Hansard transcript of a question and answer from Senate estimates, where former Senator Eric Abetz is asking, is the ABC considering adopting the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism? If not, why not? And basically the answer concludes, after a bit of fluff, the ABC is an independent public broadcaster, sets its own editorial policies and guidance, and senior editors are satisfied that the current settings are appropriate. So that's a bit of a quick overview of some of the issues that we've seen. So can I ask you, Maurice, the article that you wrote, why did you write it? What did you want to achieve by airing it from the point of view of a former chairman?
Well, I think that the continuation of the ABC under its current management in its current form is frankly a scandal.
Right.
It is taking $1.1 billion of taxpayers' funds. It has a diminishing audience, significantly diminishing in radio and television, which means the cost per person who is being subsidised to watch it is increasing. But more particularly, it offends its basic principles of that are contained in the editorial policies and in the Act and in the Charter. And I think this is an outrage that we who, it's a shocking thing for the former chair to say, I don't listen to or watch the ABC anymore. My blood pressure is more important to me. But seriously, I mean, the sorts of things which you just put on the screen defy any description for an organisation that holds itself up to be trusted and to be a significant institution that's meant to be taken seriously. And as I say, I think it is that it constantly, I'll use the term lies. Other people may use a more friendly name, a friendly word, but essentially they distort. And I take you to the point that was raised in our communication, yours and mine, when they argued that you were invited to attend that particular was it 7:30 or?
I think it was a Q&A.
It was Q&A. Sorry, it was Q&A. And we know that you were invited to attend in the audience, but not as a member of the panel. But the clear inference was that you were invited to be on the panel when that was untrue. And it's this sort of, it's just not acceptable, but there's no consequences. And we see I won't go on, David, but time and time again, we see that the ABC looks after its own. We saw Louise Milligan's writings in relation to lambing and on her private Twitter account. The ABC picked up the $200,000, or at least you and I and the rest of us who pay taxes picked up her legal and defamation costs. We've seen it with Cardinal Pell, where I think there was something. Anyway, I won't go on, but the fact is that they're prepared to protect these people. There don't seem to be any consequences, and they just go on offending.
Yeah. Why do you think they have? Look, from our point of view, we see a major problem with the coverage whenever Israel is in the news, and we think there's a lot of evidence of quite strong bias. Any idea why that might be the case?
Well, I think the answer must be that there's an ideological strain within the ABC, the culture, which is so powerful that it crowds out any alternative view. When I was the chair, one of the things that I really pleaded with them was to be more curious, more open to alternative points of view. But that doesn't happen. It didn't even happen when I was there. I was shut down.
Is reform possible? And if you could wave a magic wand, what changes would you like to see happen?
I don't think it's possible to change. I think that the culture is so deeply embedded. And of course, if you continue to employ people of like mind who want to only accept the views that are acceptable to that coterie, then you're not going to change anything. And so I think it is so deeply entrenched. And it's not only that, there are supporting organisations like the Friends of the ABC,
Yeah.
the Greens, and all of these people who cozy up, or the ABC cozies up to them and they cozy up to the ABC. And as I say, it's self-reinforcing. And unless you were to start again with people who actually had differing points of view, I can't see how it is in any way reformable.
I don't know much about this. You might know a little more, Maurice. But is there a proposal with the BBC to introduce a subscription service rather
Yes.
than? Yeah, would something like that be worth considering in Australia?
Well, yes, I think that's one way in which at least the taxpayer is let off the hook. But again, it's going to be an extraordinarily long and hard road to ever get something like that up. I mean, when you look at the number of people who are now watching and listening to the ABC, you wonder how it is that they have become so powerful. I mean, partly I understand that because it's a megaphone for the Greens and for the people on the left, and in particular the far left, to keep getting their ideology and their points of view out into the mainstream. But even then, they're starting to run into difficulties, which is why there is this proposal to reform by changing the method of going more digital than they have in the past, without recognising it. If you're going to put rubbish on any platform, whether it's digital or terrestrial, you're still going to end up with rubbish, and people are still not wanting to listen or watch.
Having a national broadcaster, of course, began when there wasn't access to the internet, when there wasn't the current technology. If one was to take an arm's length, dispassionate look at the ABC, what components of it would you say are essential services?
I don't know if there are any more. There is any more a case for essential services. Commercial radio, commercial television. There's all sorts of services. If you're looking at emergency services, for example, you can. There are all sorts of apps that you can now subscribe to, which will tell you a fire near you or whatever it is. So that reason is no longer there. Originally in the 30s, it was established because the continent is so vast, so sparsely populated. It was considered that this was a way of unifying the country, bringing people together under sort of some unifying common culture, common sense of values. All of that is now gone. And I think for anybody in Parliament or anywhere else to, if we didn't have an ABC, to put forward a proposal that we spend $1 billion worth of taxpayers' funds establishing a national broadcaster, I think you'd be laughed out of court. I mean, because news is so ubiquitous, so cheap to obtain, it's everywhere. And particularly the younger generation, not interested in watching the television in any event. They get their news and other information from alternative sources.
Well, I think some older people do as well. Social media has become just such a powerful and pervasive method of communication. So unless there are, remote areas of Australia where no other form of communication is available, and I don't know whether that's the case, you're shaking your head. So there are solutions everywhere.
I don't believe there's anywhere in Australia now that you can't get access, whether you do it by satellite or however you want to get that access. In any event, I mean, one of the arguments I constantly hear is, well, it's very important in the bush. Well,
Yeah.
We have a farm in the bush, and I can tell you there aren't that many people that I've ever spoken to in the bush who say we would be lost without the ABC. It may well be that they have a greater audience out there. I'm not able to say whether that's right or not. What I will say is that we don't need to spend $1.1 billion a year servicing those people.
Right. Okay. Well, we've just got a couple of minutes before we open up for questions. And I know you've got strong and clear views on the current issue that's dominating political discussion at the moment, which is the proposal for an Aboriginal voice to be put into the Constitution. What's your assessment of the proposal?
I think it is wrong-headed. I think it is totally divisive, and I think in the longer run will be extremely destructive for the interest of the Aboriginal people. I do not know of one reason why Aboriginal people will be better off as a consequence of the voice than they are today. And I very much applaud Jacinta Price's view that we don't need another voice. What we want is ears. And unfortunately, people are not prepared to listen to what it is that is required, because it offends their preconceptions of Aboriginal people living somehow or other as they did for thousands of years, but at the same time tapping into all of the privileges and luxury and advances that we have in modern society, and it's incompatible. And I think just to finish, David, it strikes me that in the last census, there are about 840,000 people who identified as being Indigenous. Now, that was up 25% on the 2016 census, only 5 years previous. But that said, you'd have to argue around maybe 200,000 of those people are living in town camps and in remote communities, and they are the ones who are living in misery and who are essentially drinking themselves or drugging themselves to death. They're the issues that need to be addressed, but no one wants to tackle it.
Yeah, well, we're in lockstep on this, and I guess if anybody wants to ask a question about the voice as well, we've opened it up to that possibility. We usually have a 1 minute promo, which I will do now, and we'll allow a little extra time for questions. So as we do each week, at the end of the event, if you're not yet actively supporting AJA, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, where you can apply for membership, you can make a donation, and we do need support to continue our own this important work. Make sure that you like and follow the Facebook page for continuous updates on news and views. Next week, we are fortunate to host Bassam Eid, who's a Palestinian Arab human rights activist. Some of you might have seen some of his work. He's one of the most outspoken Palestinian Arabs supporting Israel, calling out anti-Semitism, particularly in the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA, and that's what we'll be talking about next week. So, Robert, we can invite questions.
Yeah, let's go to some questions. We've got a lot of questions. I think David Schulberg had a question.
Okay, if you can unmute David and ask yours.
My question is regarding the complaints process. Now, I've lodged many complaints. I've lodged one a week ago. I won't go into details of the complaint, but I'd like to know, well, I've heard from certain sources in the community that the Ombudsman at the moment is more receptive to complaints. And David, you might describe what the AJA has done in its successes and how long it takes for the turnover and whether the effort is worth the result.
Well, sorry, you over to me, David?
Yes, over to you.
Look, the number of complaints which are upheld are minuscule relative to the number of complaints which they receive. There were thousands, literally thousands of complaints lodged as a consequence of the coronation broadcast. I am unaware of anybody unaware of some who have lodged their complaints who've received an apology or any suitable response. What I can say to you is when I was the chair, I had a complaint from a senior Australian, well-known and a person of integrity. He and I had different views philosophically, but he complained to me that in his role as a director of a major Australian corporation, he had been defamed because it was argued the company he chaired was, and I quote, dumping toxic tailings into the sea. He, in desperation, reached out to me. I took it up with management. And management said, oh, no, this is one of our best journalists. There's nothing to see here. I subsequently discovered that the footage which showed tailings being dumped into the sea were, in fact, not from that company at all. I'm not even sure whether it was in Papua New Guinea where this is alleged to have taken place. So this is the sort of thing that, anyway, the point, at the end of the day, I was able to show that what we had portrayed was completely misleading and untrue, and an apology, a fulsome apology, was given to this person. Now, I would argue if that person didn't have the chairman of the ABC in his or her corner, no apology would have been given. Maybe he would have taken defamation action in the courts, but it's hardly satisfactory, particularly given the lack of substance in what was being broadcast.
And I'll just add to that, because you asked about the AJA, how we had them upheld, and I lodged both of those. They were both lodged within 24 hours and upheld with completely different stories. The stories were about a week apart. And I think they were just so outrageous that there was no way they couldn't have been upheld. One of them, they actually called a terrorist who spent years in prison, they called him a freedom fighter, which is, it's not even calling him a militant or something like that. And the other one was several terrorists were killed, and they ran a whole article describing these Palestinians that were killed without ever mentioning they were claimed by a terrorist organization. They were carrying weapons. They'd shot at the soldiers first. Some of the soldiers were injured. There was just so many details, and that other major international outlets like CNN and BBC had also named them as members of a militant group. So the ombudsman, they did uphold both claims, although they definitely didn't apologize, and they said, we stand by the article. We're just going to add a little note at the bottom. That was what they said with one. And with the other one, they said they'll change, even though a couple of weeks later, I saw they were still using the original story. So I don't know what to make of that, but let's go to Anne, who's got our next question.
Just before Anne asks a question, I'll just add that even when you win, the damage is already done. In the two cases that Robert referred to, it wasn't all that long after the event. It might have been 10 days or 2 weeks. The ABC issues a correction. Who's going to go back and reread the story with the correction in it?
Nobody. And it's at the bottom of the story is a one-line, editor's note. They added in. Nobody 10 days later is going to read about
exactly
minor international news.
David, if I could just interpose one, I know there are other questions. I just want to make the point, because you asked me earlier, why do I write these things? Why do I feel the way that I do? It's for that very reason. I hate hypocrisy. I hate this pretense that they are actually out there to be trusted because they keep presenting the people with facts, when those two examples you've just given are outright fabrications.
Yeah. Anne, your question.
Maurice, you were talking about the notion of a national broadcaster, which is such an outdated concept nowadays, really. How is it going to be possible at all, given the fact that national broadcasters really don't break much news, really, or cover top investigations anymore? Is it possible at all to disband it at all, so given the fact it is really a useless concept now?
Well, I've been trying without any success. I mean, one of the things which struck me, the former Communications Minister, Paul Fletcher, he had a discussion with me early on in his tenure, asking for my advice on what I thought should happen with the ABC. I strongly recommended either a Royal Commission or a thorough root and branch independent inquiry into the operations and the structure of the ABC. His response was he thought that would create more heat than light, and he thought that the answer was to put the headquarters out to Parramatta. Now, that's really no solution, and it's just playing with the answer. I mean, it'll make no difference whatsoever. So, and the BBC has found similar outcome. They've moved some of their activities to the north of Britain. It made no difference to the underlying culture because it is so embedded.
All right, Terry, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, I won't make any secret of my views. I call it their ABC, and I'd love it to be broken up or sold off in little bits. But really, just following on what Anne just asked, we see all sorts of scandals in public broadcasting corporations now. You're probably aware of the current Jimmy Savile Mark II debacle at the BBC. I hear similar sort of things about the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Do you sense any international push by people in these countries? I know that they're looking at dropping the license fee which funds the BBC. Do you sense any international push from the bottom up just to get rid of these public broadcasting corporations, which really aren't required anymore?
No. Look, my sense is that ultimately these things will implode. I think the ABC is in a terminal condition. Whether or not they broadcast using a digital platform or whatever else what they have in mind, it's the content that people are turning away from. And there comes a point where you have to say, if you're a politician, how can we justify such large sums of money going to so few people? And it loses its relevance. I think it's largely lost its relevance, but there is no international movement that I'm aware of. And let's face it, as you point out, there is no justification for having a taxpayer-funded national broadcaster or any other form of broadcaster in the world that we now live in. There's no shortage of all sorts of news and information that you can get, entertainment, you name it, Netflix, whatever it is. There's no shortage. There's no justification for spending $1.1 billion on what is an activist organisation.
Norman Schuller, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Mr. Newman, I'd be very interested to hear your view on public companies supporting the yes vote, which they are actively doing. And at the same time, as the Institute of Company Directors, we all know our responsibilities as company directors. We take them seriously, and we know the penalties that are involved. And in particular, as the Institute, virtually telling its directors it's okay to sign a blank check because that is what one is doing.
Yeah, I'm totally in agreement. I think that the spectacle of large corporations signing $2 million and donating $2 million to the Yes campaign is outrageous. They have no mandate for that. They are appropriating the brand of their company to put behind their to give more weight to their decision, and of course they're giving cash which could easily be distributed to shareholders by way of dividends. So I think that it is absolutely wrong morally, and it may well be at some point people get so outraged they lodge class action. because if they had polled their shareholders and said, look, we'd like to give $2 million to the Yes campaign, and it's interesting that most of these companies have a $2 million, whether that's the amount that the chair or the board has authority to sign off on, I don't know, but they're all giving $2 million. And I think that this is going to backfire. I mean, it's quite interesting in a totally different sense that you will have seen that Budweiser in the United States used some transsexual person to advertise Bud Light. That company in the space of 6 months has lost $23 billion worth of market capitalization and has gone from #1 seller to number 26. While no one has been sacked as a consequence, it's interesting that the marketing manager and other people have left the building. So I think that while they may not have had the courage to say, well, you're being fired for having done that, the message is getting through. And I think this is the way it can only come through the shareholders and others banding together and say this is not acceptable. And I agree with you with the AICD. It is a totally woke organization which is pushing ideology, pushing ESG, inclusion, diversity, and all of those things to the ultimate detriment of the business itself, because people are spending so much time and money concentrating on matters other than improving the outcome of their business and improving the profitability.
Okay. Paul Spira, would you like to unmute and ask yours?
Thank you for the presentation. Can I just say that I realise that the ABC is the focus of today's discussion, but is the ABC just an example of a much greater problem that we're seeing, which is the dying throes of independent journalism? You can virtually predict the leanings of any particular organisation or any particular news piece just knowing where it's being aired.
Well, in a way, it's sort of where I came in to this world, that what I see is corporate socialism. You can call it fascism, you can call it whatever you like, but I think that there's a very unholy alliance that is developing between big business, big government and organised labour, and is squeezing out the individual and giving them and disempowering them. So I think that this is the direction that we are moving in, and it's very unhealthy. And it's very hard to see. And it's not just confined to journalism. You're seeing this in a whole range of areas. I mean, we saw it in COVID with, and David, you would have followed this with the TGA, where they essentially followed a particular ideological line, which was not related to science. We're seeing it with the Bureau of Meteorology. We're seeing it in a whole host of areas which are government departments which have been politicised and are putting out what is essentially propaganda. And it's very concerning, very worrying. And, you know, those of us who still have the ability, which is, I think, why we support organisations like Advance Australia or Australia Digital Holdings, ADH-TV, it's important to keep some of these organisations afloat in the hope that more and more people out there will find the courage to actually push back. I think a lot of people think the way we're well, what I'm hearing within this organisation, we think, but I think more and more people hopefully will get the courage to push back.
Well, I've only got a surname Cohen. You're unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. Look, first of all, David, I'd like to congratulate you on your article in The Spectator. It was excellent.
Thank you.
And Maurice, you've virtually uncovered the point I was going to bring up to you. In a democratic country, I can see no reason for there to be a government-run and financially backed media organisation. We could sell the ABC in two sections, one as a regional network, this is radio and TV, and the other as a general company, you know, that can operate all around Australia. However, it would bring a fresh line of competition in the media industry, which I think would be, given what someone said about the standard that it's in, I think would be very, very welcome, because you wouldn't have an unfunded TV network called the government trying to block out the other stations at times.
Okay.
And,
You need to ask your question.
Well, the question is, why can't we sell it? We get about over $1 billion. We wouldn't have to fork out $1 billion a year, and we would get money in from income of the wages, and which is run privately, and also for any profits made, tax.
Okay, I think we got the point.
And I think, I mean, you're kicking on an open door. I absolutely agree with you. I'll just read to you what Sir Richard Boyer, who was the longest serving chair of the ABC, said, that he wanted the broadcaster to stand solid and serene in the middle of our national life, running no campaign, seeking to persuade to no opinion, but presenting the issues fairly and fearlessly for the calm judgment of the people. Now, if we had an organisation that pursued those objectives and was faithful to what Sir Richard Boyer advocated, we wouldn't even be discussing this. But it's not possible to imagine the ABC could have strayed further from Sir Richard Boyer's vision. And so, yes, if anybody was prepared to pick up the spectrum that the ABC currently occupies in radio and TV, by all means increase competition out there. There is some pushback, I think, in the United States coming. We're beginning to see, we saw it a bit with Twitter, and I think there are people like Newsmax and others who are now starting to push a different point of view than is where the mainstream, most of the mainstream media are at. And I think that is at least encouraging, because I don't think there's any question that out in the mainstream, in Australia more generally, in the broader community, there is an appetite for alternative points of view, which they're not getting from any of the current mainstream media sources.
We've still got quite a few questions, so I'll ask to keep questions as brief as possible. Reuven, would you like to ask yours? Reuven, can you unmute? You're you're okay now.
Thanks. Yeah. As far as biased reporting and propaganda against Israel, which would you consider the lesser of two evils between the SBS and the ABC?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't watch either of them, so I'm unable to say. But I do know from what I read, with what I've heard tonight, what I've seen with David in his writings, and what I've seen elsewhere, is the ABC certainly has set a high bar or a low bar, whichever one you want to use. Whether SBS is able to better those, I don't know. But whoever it is, whether it's SBS, if it's publicly funded, it is absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, I think when SBS puts up its Al Jazeera feed, it gets pretty close. Saul, your turn. Saul, can you unmute?
Yeah.
Okay, you're with us.
Mr. Newman, thank you very much indeed for a most interesting discussion. Could I ask you two simple questions, but maybe hard to answer? When and why do you think the rot set in? And incidentally, one would think that the ABC would really love it if everyone in Australia had a Volksempfänger, except probably they haven't got the historical knowledge to realise what that would mean.
Yeah. No, I think you're quite right. I think that's a fair analysis. The rot set in, I think, in the 70s, when they employed a person who ran their news division who is a communist. I mean, no point in beating around that bush. And he employed people of similar mind, similar ideology. And I think over time, this has become deeply embedded within the organisation. And I suppose one of the things that really rankles with me is this pretense that somehow the ABC is not biased, because under any judgment, it leans very, very directly and solely in one towards one ideology. There's no point in defending it. And it just makes me so cross that they continue to do so. It's inarguable.
Maurice, I'm going to pick up a written question because it is also very topical. And someone's asked about the so-called misinformation, disinformation bill that the government is currently advancing. What's your thought on that?
Well, it's censorship. I mean, it's just another step towards authoritarianism. I don't think we could come. I mean, I think one of the operative words is what somebody considers to be harmful. What you consider to be harmful, what I consider to be harmful, may be very different. And this is the point. And this is one of the things that I battled with at the ABC, that individuals, that means the audience, are not capable of making their own minds up. They have to be told, because they can't be trusted to come to the right decision.
Alan, you're up.
Thanks, David. Maurice, an often heard criticism of the ABC is that there is not one Conservative commentator presenting any current affairs program. Now, this is not a grey area. I mean, it's clearly demonstrably true. So surely this has been noticed in the corridors of power. So how has the management, or has the management ever been asked to justify this? And if not, how can they so easily swat this away?
Well, because they're not held to account. It's simple. The board is captured by management. The management, as I've said, is a self-supporting collective, and there's never anybody there to hold them to account. So they just keep on going. When it came to the so-called removal of the indexation, they said this was the end of democracy as we know it, and the mass sackings of staff. In fact, they increased the number of staff by 120, and the ABC has never been a supporter of democracy, so that wasn't affected either. But this is the point, and they, when asked how many people have been let go as a consequence of the government's initiative, that question had to be taken on notice before the managing director came back and said, well, actually, we didn't lose anybody, we increased the number.
Hugh Kitson.
Hello, Maurice. I'm joining you from the UK. I lived in Australia, and in fact, I worked at the ABC back in the early 70s as a film editor in the newsroom. But I just wanted to make a comment. What you have to say about the ABC in Australia is mirrored in the BBC here. As far as Israel, anti-Israel bias in the BBC, fortunately, that is coming up for a parliamentary inquiry. Whether that achieves anything or not remains to be seen. But what you've said about the ABC is absolutely reflected in the BBC.
Okay.
And I have no doubt that there's a lot of interaction between the two.
Jeff, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Shalom. I remember the 40th anniversary, or maybe it was the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. Black Line and the 730 report lacerated Israel's efforts in defending itself. And I would have thought at the time you don't get much worse, but you do get much worse, and they have been much worse to the extent that they no longer accept any complaints from private individuals. I had quite a few published in my time on their website, also in emails. No chance of doing that now. They are indeed not accountable, but there must be some sort of an ombudsperson. Maybe you can create an ombudsperson with sarcasm intended. Maybe you can create an ombudsperson to enable an insight into the ABC and their machinations.
Well, they have an ombudsperson, but maybe there's been a slight uptick in the number of complaints which have been accepted. But as was said earlier, a lot of those complaints may be acknowledged, but the same footage appears on their website. So it's shameless.
Philip Siegel.
Hi. Please don't take my question as defending the ABC, but is there anything good about the ABC?
Well, I suppose it employs people.
All right. Richard, you're up.
I, amongst others, complained to the ABC after that Q&A episode a few years ago, and the last piece of correspondence I got from them basically said that the ABC doesn't have to give an unbiased view on anything. It can follow community views, and I guess that's their word for saying, you know, they can follow their left-wing woke agenda. I mean, is that correct? I think it was the ombudsman or that actually wrote that last piece, because it went through a couple of layers. Is that actually correct?
Well, it may have changed since I was there, but I'm unaware of that. And I would have thought there is no justification whatsoever for a publicly funded organisation to take a stand on anything. It's not entitled to an opinion.
Leon, would you like to unmute?
Yes, good evening, Mr. Newman. According to the legislation, I presume legislation established the ABC, or according to the ABC Charter, to whom is the ABC accountable?
Well, in theory.
Yeah, it's accountable to the minister on behalf of the public taxpayers. But, and of course, within the organisation itself, there is a chief executive who reports to the board. And the company, the corporation, has an annual report which is tabled in the Parliament. But ultimately, it's the minister on behalf of the tax-paying shareholders.
Robert Boyer. Robert, you need to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay, you win.
Assuming that a miracle happens and a Conservative government is returned in the near future, do you think they would have the balls to take on the ABC?
No, I mean, I think we've already been there, done that. There doesn't seem to be any will to take it on. As I said, I spoke with the former minister when he was new into the job. He didn't think that having a thorough investigation, a Royal Commission or a root and branch inquiry would do anything but add heat rather than light. And the solution was to move the headquarters out to Parramatta. So, you know, if that's the level of courage that so-called Conservative governments are prepared to exhibit, I can't imagine where people from a different colour would come down.
Yeah, I'm just going to show one more document. This was given to me after we exposed some ABC complaints. It's a history, and these are the people that compiled it. It's a 65-page document of various attempts to resolve complaints about the ABC coverage of Israel. Now, it is historical, but it illustrates to everyone that this is not a new phenomenon. It is a chronic phenomenon, and that's part of the index I'm showing on the screen at the moment. And I have given copies of that dossier to at least 3 or 4 senators. So we can't say that people in Parliament are unaware, but as Maurice Newman has outlined forcibly, that it seems to be only theoretically, but not practically accountable in any way. How do we get a copy of that? Yeah, I mean, someone said, how do you get a copy? Send me an email. I'll send you a copy of that that dossier. Okay.
So we had a written question there about the IRA definition, which you mentioned earlier, ABC not accepting it, but AJ has identified that one of the priority areas is media. I mean, ABC's, maybe you want to elaborate on that, David? It's the most...
Well, someone who's very well informed is there. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism includes some working examples that address the question of when does criticism of Israel cross the line into anti-Semitism. And you can criticize Israel as you would any other country, but there are certain things that cross the line. And the ABC is one of the organisations, one of the few public organisations that formally rejected the adoption of the IRA, saying that their existing mechanisms are adequate. I mean, clearly they're not. I see Hugh Kitson's written that the BBC has also refused to adopt IRA. Our major political parties both say they support it, but it comes down again to a theme that Maurice Newman has been talking about, that until, or if ever, we have politicians with the strength to change and implement policy, it's not there. Okay. Maurice, do you want to make any further comment in closing, and then we'll wind up?
Well, not really, and I don't want to be seen to be drawing too big a bow, but I don't think it is a particularly big bow. But I'm particularly conscious, and maybe because of my upbringing, where I was born, etc., and watching what happened in Nazi Germany, I really am genuinely concerned. We are moving around the world in the West to a more authoritarian regime. I recall reading in the diary that Sebastian Haffner wrote during, just after Hitler came to office in 1933, that watching what was happening in Germany was like watching a play from the comfort of a box in the theatre. And I have a sense that that's what we're doing. We're looking at what's unfolding in front of our eyes as if we're in the box of a theatre, as if this is surreal and not really happening. But it is happening. It has extremely dangerous and certainly, as we know, potentially devastating impacts on us all. And whatever we can do to push back and to fight, we need to do.
Yeah, well, we're part of the effort, and thank you so much for your time and your effort. The work that you're doing with Advance Australia and elsewhere is very important. I've seen some of the results, and if, for example, the proposed referendum is defeated, it will be in no small part due to people like Maurice Newman and getting behind the organisational infrastructure that's required to mount a good campaign. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for being so open and direct in answering the questions.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm privileged to have attended.
Robert, back to you.
Thank you again, Maurice. As David said, very informative talk, and we can see from the audience questions that I don't think anybody here disagreed with you. So yeah, it's quite a commonly held views. Just before we go, the L'chaim show with Maurice Klein is on now on 3ZZZ or FM 92.3. That's all we have time for tonight. Don't forget, you can keep up to date what AJ is doing by joining our free email list at jewishassociation.org.au, as well as on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of them. But for now, we wish you a very good evening. We look forward to seeing you next week with Bassam Ayed an Arab Palestinian human rights activist. Thank you again, Maurice, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you.